how it exists or what it does. Essentially, it collects signals intelligence, phone records and things like that, metadata, and it collects massive amounts of signals intelligence. Again, this is where it gets hard to get your head around this. So James Banford, who's also an activist journalist several years ago, he came across a memo that said by 2015, which was a few years ago, he said that the NSA would be collecting information at the level of the yottabyte. Okay, what's a yottabyte? It's 10 to the power of 24 bytes. Okay, what does that mean? Well, in 2012, every computer on the planet did not have the combined power of a yottabyte. That's how much information the NSA is processing. A few years ago. We don't know anymore. It obviously is expanding. The NSA is also collecting, thanks to Snowden, we know that it is collecting every single piece of communications in Afghanistan and in the Bahamas. Everything. Every phone call, every text, everything. So those are interesting examples. The fifth example is obviously Facebook. We all know Facebook collects enormous amounts of information, but again, here we run up against the problems of human ability to understand this. Facebook collects data at the level of the terabyte. For those, like, this is 10 to the power of 12 bytes of information. What does this mean? Some of you might be familiar with the U.S. Library of Congress. It is the largest library on earth. It is a sort of a repository of kind of everything. So if you took the U.S. Library of Congress and you digitized everything that they own, you would have roughly 10 terabytes of information. Every day, Facebook collects 500 terabytes of information. And that data is from a few years ago now, so it's hard to keep up with this. So that's my first, and probably the most important master pattern, is the massive expansion and intensification of surveillance. I've talked a lot about signals intelligence, but you could round it out by talking about DNA and body scanners and drones and satellites, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's the first one. The second, we're going to move through some, my surveillanceization point. So the next one is blurred boundaries. And this is the second master pattern. It used to be the case that information was stored in what we now refer to as informational silos. These were often tied to unique bureaucracies. So the medical bureaucracy and the policing bureaucracy and the education bureaucracy, they all had their own unique silos and databases of information. And these typically worked reasonably well within their own domain, but information typically was not shared across. It was very difficult, it was very expensive, very laborious to share information across these. The second major trend involves breaking down those silos. And this has been particularly the case with information technology that's allowed for this. And in fact, it was one of the most prominent recommendations of the 9/11 report in the United States that policing and security agencies should break down informational silos across security agencies. But it's not just security agencies. Particularly important have been commercial agencies that collect all of this signals intelligence. And one of the major trends in policing in the last 20 years have been ongoing efforts to try and get access to signals intelligence data from private companies. And they have done this through a process of what surveillance scholars call deputization, that they've given them powers to share information, they have coerced them, they have brought lawsuits against them, and when they can't get it legally, we know from Snowden, they just break in and put in backdoors and access the information illegally. So this has been a huge trend. It's particularly appealing for the state to get information this way because, particularly in the United States, there are actually legal restrictions on it. You're not allowed to collect this information. So what they found is that you're not allowed to collect it, But if they get it from somebody else, that works around the legalities, so that's very appealing to get information from TELUS or Rogers, or I don't know who the big Vodafone or whoever it is. So what you see here is an increasing importance of corporate information in a larger profile of surveillance. This isn't just a state thing, it is a hybrid blending of state and private things. At the same time, corporations are very eager to distance themselves from their surveillance practices. They're uncomfortable with the public knowing that this is what they're doing. And I think this was apparent a few years ago when all of the big companies, all the big Google and Amazon came out with a letter in the New York Times that they took out, and they were trying a petition to stop the state from doing surveillance. So I found this very distasteful. Google and Amazon, these companies' entire business model is based on surveillance, but they're trying to sort of gloss this. And I think what's really important here is that what this breaking down of silos of information has done is that it has radicalized the trend in information, in the expansion and intensification of information. So I'm gonna flip a few here, sorry. Yes. So on the bottom, historically surveillance, it's slow, it evolved and there was more and more of it. But when you take all of these bureaucracies and you combine them and you allow them to share information like this, you have an exponential growth in surveillance capacity. And this is clearly one of the most important trends. Okay. So, third, transformed hierarchies of surveillance. So what we're seeing is a transformation in the hierarchical structure of surveillance. And this is a broad generalization, but I think it's generally true. It used to be the case that surveillance was predominantly directed at the marginalized and the dispossessed in society, the dangerous classes. These were the ones who were sort of singled out for coercive surveillance. Powerful groups were not generally open to the same levels of surveillance. And that has, so just to give you an example of this, a historical example, it used to be that in French court society in like the 1600s and the 1700s, if a dignitary was visiting Paris, they would dress up just a normal person as the king. And then they would sort of see how long they could carry this on before they realized this isn't really the king. Because nobody knew what the king looked like. He was on a coin. You couldn't even imagine that today. We know too much about our political leaders. We know too much about